Major Sarah Chen slid into seat 8A with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to sleep anywhere. Cockpits, transport planes, even standing up during 12-hour missions. The red-eye from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. was packed with business travelers and families, but Sarah barely noticed. Her body ached with the kind of exhaustion that came from 3 consecutive weeks flying combat missions in classified airspace, the kind she couldn't discuss with anyone, not even the chatty businessman now settling into 8B. The overhead bin clicked shut above her head, sealing away her small carry-on that contained everything she'd taken overseas: 2 changes of clothes, toiletries, and a worn paperback she'd never found time to read. 23 days. That's how long she'd been gone from American soil, flying missions she'd never be able to mention in polite conversation, seeing things that would remain locked in classified briefings for the next 50 years. Her muscles remembered every high-G turn, every emergency maneuver, every moment of controlled chaos at 40,000 feet, where a single mistake meant death. She pulled her faded Air Force Academy baseball cap low over her eyes, the fabric soft from years of wear, a gift from her father when she'd graduated at the top of her flight class 7 years ago. The businessman in 8B was already trying to make conversation, his laptop open, his cologne too strong for the confined space. "Heading home or heading out?" he asked with the forced cheerfulness of someone who feared silence. "Home," Sarah said simply, her voice polite but final, the tone that said she wasn't interested in the life story of a stranger. She'd learned this skill the hard way. Commercial flights were full of people who wanted to talk about themselves, and the moment anyone discovered she was a fighter pilot, the questions became endless. "Where do you fly? Have you seen combat? What's it like being a woman in the military? Have you ever shot anyone?" The questions ranged from genuine curiosity to uncomfortable invasiveness, and Sarah had long ago decided that her off-duty hours belonged to silence. The flight attendant, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a name tag that read Jennifer, stopped at their row with a practiced smile. "Can I get you anything before we take off? Water, juice. We have complimentary snacks in the—" "I'm fine, thank you," Sarah interrupted gently, not wanting to be rude but needing this woman to understand she just wanted to be left alone. Jennifer's smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes showed she understood. Flight attendants developed a sixth sense for reading passengers, knowing who wanted attention and who wanted invisibility. As Jennifer moved on to the next row, Sarah let her head rest against the cool window, watching ground crew load the last pieces of luggage into the cargo hold. San Francisco International sprawled beneath the orange glow of sodium lights, a city preparing for sleep while travelers like her prepared for journeys through the night. In the terminal, she could see other gates, other planes, other lives intersecting for brief moments before scattering again across the continent. The past 3 weeks played through her mind in fragments, the pre-dawn briefings in secure rooms where maps couldn't be photographed, the weight of her helmet as she climbed into her F-16's cockpit, the controlled chaos of air traffic over hostile territory, the moment when her wingman called out a missile lock and every instinct she'd ever trained kicked in simultaneously. She'd brought her aircraft home every time. Not everyone had. One pilot from another squadron hadn't made it back. Sarah had attended the memorial service via video call from the base, watching a flag-draped coffin being loaded onto a transport plane, watching a widow accept a folded flag, watching children who would grow up without a father. That's what exhaustion really was, not just physical tiredness, but the emotional weight of responsibility, of life-and-death decisions made at 600 miles per hour, of knowing that coming home safe meant she was lucky, skilled, or some combination of both that might not hold the next time. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'm Michael Torres, and on behalf of the entire crew, I'd like to welcome you aboard Flight 447 with non-stop service to Washington Dulles. The voice was warm, confident, with the slight Texas drawl of someone who'd probably learned to fly in wide-open skis. "We're currently number 3 for takeoff, so we'll have you in the air shortly. Flight time today will be approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes. We're expecting smooth conditions most of the way, though we might encounter some light chop over the Rockies. Sit back, relax, and we'll have you on the ground in DC before you know it." Sarah almost smiled at that. Smooth conditions, light chop, the language of civilian aviation, where turbulence was an inconvenience rather than a threat, where flying was routine rather than combat. She'd grown up in this world. Her father had been a commercial pilot for United before retiring, and she still remembered the magic of those childhood flights in jump seats, watching her dad command a massive aircraft with the same calm competence Captain Torres now displayed. But those memories felt like they belonged to a different person. The girl who dreamed of flying while watching clouds from a cockpit had grown into a woman who flew through those clouds at supersonic speeds, who made split-second decisions that affected national security, who carried the weight of classified missions that would never appear in any official record. Sometimes Sarah wondered what her younger self would think if she could see what she'd become, whether that starry-eyed girl would be proud or frightened. The engine spooled up, that distinctive whine of turbines building power, and Flight 447 began to taxi toward the runway. The businessman in 8B had given up on conversation and was now absorbed in a spreadsheet, his brow furrowed in concentration. Across the aisle, a young mother was settling a baby into a bassinet, humming softly. 2 rows back, a group of college students was laughing about something, their youth and energy a stark contrast to Sarah's bone-deep weariness. The plane turned onto the runway, and Sarah felt the familiar sensation of engines throttling up to full power, pressing her back into the seat. Takeoff, the moment when metal and physics and human skill combined to defy gravity, when tons of machinery lifted into the air because mathematics said it could. She'd experienced this thousands of times from both sides of the cockpit, but it never quite lost its wonder. The wheels left the ground. San Francisco fell away beneath them, a glittering sprawl of lights bordering the dark expanse of the Pacific. Sarah watched until the city became just another pattern of luminescence against the darkness, then pulled down the window shade. She declined Jennifer's offer of a beverage when the cart came by, politely waved off the snack basket, and let the familiar hum of the engines lull her towards sleep. Her last conscious thought was relief that for the next 4 hours she had no responsibilities, no missions, no decisions to make. She was just another passenger, anonymous and safe, flying home. 23 combat missions, 4 air medals, 3 weeks of classified operations, and absolutely no one on this commercial flight would ever know that the tired woman in the window seat had just spent the last month defending her country at altitudes where mistakes meant death. That's exactly how she preferred it. As Flight 447 climbed through 30,000 feet into the clear night sky, Sarah's breathing slowed, her muscles finally releasing tension they'd held for weeks, her mind drifting into the darkness of exhausted sleep. She never imagined that in 90 minutes, every passenger on this plane would be counting on those very skills she was so carefully hiding. She never imagined that seat 8A would become the place where a quiet hero sat before the world needed her. But that was still 90 minutes away. For now, Major Sarah Chen simply slept, dreaming of smooth skis and peaceful landings, unaware that the universe had other plans entirely. The jolt snapped Sarah awake with the instant alertness of a combat pilot. No grogginess, no confusion, just the immediate transition from sleep to full consciousness that came from years of training where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Her internal clock, honed by countless missions and time zone shifts, told her they'd been airborne about 90 minutes. She did the math automatically. Cruising altitude, probably 37,000 feet, somewhere over the Rockies based on flight time from San Francisco. The seatbelt sign dinged on with an electronic chime that seemed too cheerful for the situation. Around her, passengers stirred, some annoyed at being woken, others already gripping armrests with white knuckles. But this wasn't ordinary turbulence. Sarah had felt enough rough air to know the difference between nature's bumps and something mechanical, something wrong. The plane was shuddering in a way that made her grip the armrest, her fighter pilot instinct screaming that this aircraft was struggling with something more than just weather. She pushed up the window shade, flooding her row with the pale light of a moonbright night. Outside, the wing looked normal at first glance, no visible ice, no obvious damage. But the way the aileron was twitching, making constant micro-adjustments, told her the pilots were fighting to keep the aircraft level. The shuddering came in waves, rhythmic and persistent, like a heartbeat that wasn't quite right. The businessman in 8B had woken up, his laptop sliding off his tray table. He caught it with fumbling hands, his face pale in the dim cabin light. "Is this normal?" he asked, his earlier confidence replaced by barely controlled fear. "I fly all the time, but this doesn't feel normal." Sarah turned to look at him, saw genuine terror in his eyes, and felt that familiar protective instinct kick in. The same one that made her volunteer to fly the most dangerous missions, to cover her wingman 6, to put herself between danger and those who couldn't defend themselves. "Turbulence can feel worse than it is," she said calmly, keeping her voice level and reassuring even though her own mind was cataloging problems. "The pilots have it under control." But even as she said it, she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Around them, the cabin was transforming from sleepy calm to anxious awareness. A mother 2 rows up pulled her sleeping daughter closer, wrapping both arms around the child as if maternal instinct alone could shield her from whatever was happening. The girl stirred, mumbled something about needing water, oblivious to her mother's fear. Across the aisle, an elderly man was gripping his wife's hand so tightly his knuckles had gone white, while she patted his arm with forced calm, murmuring reassurances neither of them believed. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, but Sarah noticed details others missed. Jennifer's smile was still in place, but it was strained now, pulled tight across her teeth like a mask. Her movements were just a fraction too quick as she checked seatbelts, her eyes flicking toward the cockpit door every few seconds. Another attendant, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, was making his way down the opposite aisle, and Sarah saw his hands trembling slightly as he reached to help a passenger secure their tray table. The attendants exchanged a glance across the cabin, brief, loaded with meaning, and Sarah read it instantly. They knew something. They'd been told something by the cockpit crew, something they weren't sharing with the passengers yet. It was the same look she'd seen between ground crew when a mission briefing went wrong, when classified information couldn't be shared but everyone knew the danger level had just escalated. Sarah's mind shifted into combat mode, that state of hyper-awareness where time seemed to slow and every detail became crystal clear. She cataloged everything. The number of passengers she counted quickly, around 140 give or take. The locations of emergency exits, 2 forward, 2 over the wings, 2 aft. The demographic makeup of the cabin, families, business travelers, a few college students, at least 3 elderly passengers she'd noticed. If something went wrong, really wrong, these details would matter. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, and Sarah's attention snapped to the speaker above her head. She'd been trained to listen not just to what was said, but how it was said. The tone, the cadence, the tiny indicators that revealed stress even in carefully controlled voices. "Folks, this is Captain Torres." The usual casual drawl was gone, replaced by something clipped, professional, almost military in its brevity. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties. Nothing to be alarmed about, but we're going to divert to Denver as a precaution. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for early arrival." Nothing to be alarmed about. Sarah had used those exact words herself, spoken them calmly over the radio to her wingman 3 months ago, seconds before an engine fire over hostile territory had turned a routine patrol into a nightmare. She'd brought her F-16 home that night on one engine and prayer, but she'd started the emergency by telling her wingman there was nothing to be alarmed about. It was what pilots said when they needed people to stay calm while everything was going to hell. Technical difficulties was even worse. A phrase so vague it could mean anything from a faulty coffee maker to catastrophic system failure. In Sarah's experience, pilots who were specific were dealing with manageable problems. Pilots who were vague were buying time to assess something they didn't fully understand yet. She leaned forward slightly, listening to the engines with ears trained to detect the slightest anomaly. The right engine sounded normal, that steady, powerful roar of a turbine operating within parameters. But the left engine, there was something off about it, a slight unevenness in the rhythm, like a heartbeat with an occasional skip. Not enough for most passengers to notice, but Sarah wasn't most passengers. Around her, the cabin was filling with nervous energy. A woman 3 rows back was crying quietly, her hands pressed to her mouth. A man in a business suit was frantically typing on his phone, probably trying to send a message before they lost signal, or before something worse happened. The college students who'd been laughing during takeoff were silent now, their youthful confidence replaced by the dawning realization that flying wasn't always safe, that metal tubes at 37,000 feet depended entirely on human skill and mechanical reliability. The businessman beside Sarah was gripping his phone so tightly she thought he might crack the screen. "I'm sure it's fine," he muttered, more to himself than to her, his voice shaking. "Just a precaution, right? They always play it safe. Better to land early than take chances. It's fine. It's totally fine." He was talking himself through fear, creating a narrative that made sense, that fit his need for the world to be safe and predictable. Sarah recognized it because she'd seen soldiers do the same thing in combat zones, convincing themselves that the suspicious vehicle ahead was just a farmer, that the distant sound was thunder not artillery, that everything would be fine because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him it would be okay, but combat had taught her never to make promises she couldn't keep. Instead, she said quietly, "The pilots know what they're doing. We're in good hands." That much at least she believed. Captain Tor's voice had been stressed but controlled, the voice of someone who'd trained for emergencies and was following procedures. Whatever was happening, they had professionals in the cockpit. But Sarah also knew that professionals could face situations beyond their training, that sometimes even the best pilots encountered problems that had no good solutions. She turned back to the window, watching the wing with increasing concern. The plane was listing slightly to the left now, just a degree or two, but enough that the pilots were having to compensate. She could see it in the way the horizon tilted, in the way the aileron kept making those constant micro-adjustments. Something was affecting their control surfaces, something subtle but persistent. Her heart rate picked up, not with fear but with the familiar sensation of a mission starting, of her mind and body preparing for action even though there was nothing she could do from seat 8A. She was a passenger here, not a pilot, just another person trusting their life to strangers in the cockpit. The helplessness of it gnawed at her. She was trained to act, to take control, to solve problems at 600 miles per hour, but here she could only sit and wait and hope. The businessman beside her was typing furiously on his phone now. "I'm sure it's fine," Sarah said nothing. She was too busy counting exits and cataloging every detail of the aircraft's behavior, her combat training overriding the fear that wanted to creep in. Old habits didn't just die hard, they never died at all. And then, without any warning at all, the situation stopped being a precaution and became an emergency. The explosion that followed would change everything. The explosion came without warning. One moment the cabin was filled with nervous tension and whispered prayers, and the next, a deafening metallic bang erupted from somewhere beneath the left wing, a sound so violent, so utterly wrong, that it seemed to come from inside Sarah's chest. The aircraft lurched violently to the left, throwing passengers against their seatbelts with enough force to leave bruises. A woman's scream cut through the air, followed by another, then a chorus of terror as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like a waterfall of yellow plastic and rubber tubing. Sarah's mask was on her face in 2 seconds flat, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd practiced emergency procedures until they became instinct. While others fumbled and panicked, she'd already secured her own mask and was turning to help the businessman in 8B, whose hands were shaking so badly he couldn't grasp the elastic straps. "Pull it tight," she told him firmly, her voice muffled but clear through the mask. "Breathe normally. You're okay." But even as she helped him, her eyes were locked on the window, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. The left engine was destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. Chunks of the turbine housing were simply gone, leaving a gaping wound in the nacelle that exposed twisted metal and severed components. Worse, far worse, a stream of hydraulic fluid was spraying from somewhere deep in the wing, a pressurized jet of red liquid that glittered in the moonlight like arterial blood. The fluid caught the airstream and atomized into a fine mist that trailed behind them like a banner announcing their catastrophe to the empty sky. Sarah's mind ran the calculations with the cold precision of someone trained to think clearly in crisis. Hydraulic system compromise meant they were losing the ability to control flight surfaces, ailerons, rudder, elevators, flaps. Without hydraulics, a modern aircraft became a 20-ton glider with all the aerodynamics of a brick. The engine failure meant asymmetric thrust, which explained why the plane was fighting to roll left. And at 37,000 feet over the Rocky Mountains, they had maybe 8 to 10 minutes before critical systems started failing completely. The plane dropped altitude so fast Sarah's stomach lurched into her throat. The sensation was sickeningly familiar. She'd felt it during combat maneuvers, during emergency descents, during that one terrible training exercise where an instructor had simulated catastrophic failure, and she'd had to recover from a flat spin. But this wasn't a simulation, and the 100+ people screaming around her weren't fellow pilots who understood the risks. The cabin had descended into chaos. The businessman beside her was hyperventilating into his oxygen mask, his eyes wide with animal terror, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths that would lead to panic-induced unconsciousness if he didn't calm down. Across the aisle, a man in his 40s was screaming, "Oh God, oh God, oh God," over and over, his voice rising in pitch with each repetition. 3 rows ahead, the mother Sarah had noticed earlier was curled over her daughter, making her body a shield, sobbing words of love and comfort to a child who was now crying in confused fear. A teenage boy in the row behind Sarah was recording on his phone, his hands shaking so badly the footage would be unwatchable, tears streaming down his face as he spoke into the camera. "Mom, Dad, if I don't make it, I love you. I'm so sorry I didn't call more. I'm so sorry." His voice broke completely. The elderly couple across the aisle sat frozen in their seats, hands clasped together so tightly their fingers had gone bloodless and white. The man's lips were moving in silent prayer while his wife stared straight ahead with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd accepted death and was simply waiting for it to arrive. They weren't screaming or crying. They'd moved past fear into a kind of terrible calm. Flight attendants were shouting instructions that almost no one could hear over the roar of wind through damaged seals and the screams of terrified passengers. Jennifer was in the aisle, her professional mask completely shattered now, tears streaming down her face as she tried to help a young woman who'd fainted, her oxygen mask dangling uselessly beside her unconscious face. The male attendant Sarah had noticed earlier was bracing himself against an overhead bin, his own mask on, shouting, "Stay calm. Stay in your seats," to passengers who were beyond hearing, beyond reason. The aircraft shuddered and groaned, metal stressed beyond design limits, protesting with sounds that seemed almost alive, screams and shrieks that spoke of structural failure, of a machine being torn apart by forces it was never meant to endure. Warning alarms were blaring from the cockpit, audible even through the reinforced door, a symphony of electronic panic that meant every system was lighting up red, every sensor screaming that something was catastrophically wrong. Then, cutting through it all like a knife through smoke, came Captain Tor's voice. Different now, no more careful calm, no more professional distance. This was the voice of a man who knew exactly how bad things were but refused to surrender to despair. The voice of someone who'd accepted the possibility of death but wasn't going down without a fight. Ladies and gentlemen, remain calm and keep your oxygen masks on. I need everyone to listen carefully. A pause, just long enough for some of the screaming to quiet, for people to register that their captain was speaking. This is an emergency. Is there anyone on board with military or commercial aviation experience? If so, I need you to identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately. We require assistance in the cockpit. I repeat, we need a pilot up here now. The cabin fell into a silence so profound it seemed to echo. 147 people, all breathing through oxygen masks, all staring at each other with the same desperate question in their eyes. Was there anyone? Could anyone help? The seconds stretched into eternity, heavy with hope and dread in equal measure. Sarah looked around the cabin, saw the teenage boy still filming his goodbye message, saw the mother clutching her daughter, saw the elderly couple resigned to fate, saw Jennifer, the flight attendant, with tears streaming down her face. She saw the businessman beside her, frozen in terror. She saw 147 souls who believed they were about to die because no one was answering the captain's call. And Sarah Chen, who'd spent her entire career serving quietly, who'd never sought recognition or glory, who trained herself to remain invisible in civilian life, felt the weight of every person on this aircraft settle onto her shoulders. She closed her eyes for just a second, one moment to acknowledge what she was about to do, to accept the responsibility, to say goodbye to anonymity. Then she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Every eye in the cabin turned to her. The businessman grabbed her arm with desperate strength. "Where are you going? We're supposed to stay seated. You can't." Sarah gently but firmly removed his hand, her voice steady and calm in a way that seemed to defy the chaos around them. "I'm a pilot," she said simply, "and I'm going to help bring us home." 147 lives had just become her responsibility, and Major Sarah Chen had never failed a mission yet. Every eye in the cabin turned to Sarah as she stood, and in that moment, she felt the weight of their hope press down on her like physical force. The businessman's fingers had left red marks on her arm where he'd grabbed her. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his brain trying to process that this quiet woman who'd barely spoken 2 words to him was now their only chance at survival. "I'm a pilot," Sarah repeated, louder this time, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded aircraft in combat zones. "United States Air Force. I can help." The lead flight attendant, Jennifer, rushed toward her down the tilted aisle, her face a mixture of desperate hope and disbelief. The plane was still descending, still shaking, and Jennifer had to grab seatbacks to keep from falling as she made her way to row 8. "Did you say you're a pilot?" Her voice cracked on the last word, years of professional composure shattered by crisis. Sarah was already moving into the aisle, her body automatically adjusting to the aircraft's unsteady motion. "Major Sarah Chen, United States Air Force. F-16 combat pilot, 2,000 flight hours including emergency situations and crisis management." She pulled her military ID from her pocket, the one she always carried but rarely showed, and handed it to Jennifer with steady hands. "I need to get to the cockpit now." Jennifer's hands shook violently as she examined the ID, her eyes scanning the official seal, the photo, the rank insignia. Then she looked up at Sarah and tears suddenly brimmed in her eyes, not tears of fear anymore, but something closer to relief, to gratitude, to desperate hope. "Thank God," she whispered, her voice breaking completely. "Oh, thank God, come with me, please come with me right now." The walk to the cockpit felt like it took hours, though it was barely 30 seconds. Every step was a journey through other people's terror, other people's final moments. Sarah passed the teenage boy who'd been recording his goodbye message. He'd stopped filming now and was just sitting there, staring at her with wide eyes full of desperate hope. "Are you really a pilot?" he asked, his voice small and broken. "Can you save us?" Sarah met his eyes, saw a kid who should have been worrying about college applications and first dates, not his own mortality. "I'm going to do everything I can," she told him, and meant it with every fiber of her being. She passed crying children, past praying passengers, past the young woman who'd fainted and was just now coming to, confused and disoriented. She heard fragments of goodbyes being spoken into phones, parents telling children they loved them one last time, spouses sharing final words across digital connections. A man in row 12 was on FaceTime with his family, his screen showing a woman and two small children. "Daddy will always love you," he was saying, tears streaming down his face. "Daddy will always," his voice broke. Sarah felt each word like a knife. These weren't soldiers who'd signed up knowing they might not come home. These were teachers and accountants and students and retirees, people who'd boarded a routine flight and now faced the unthinkable. The weight of their lives, their stories, their futures, it all pressed down on her with crushing force. An elderly woman reached out from her seat and touched Sarah's hand as she passed. The woman's fingers were paper-thin and trembling, her face lined with age and wisdom and in this moment terror. "Please," was all she said. Just that one word, laden with everything she couldn't speak. "Please save us. Please don't let this be how it ends. Please let me see my grandchildren again." "I will," Sarah promised, squeezing the woman's hand gently before continuing forward. Behind her, she heard the businessman from 8B shouting to everyone, "She's Air Force. She's a real pilot. We're going to be okay." His voice was shrill with forced optimism, trying to convince himself as much as others. The mother Sarah had noticed during boarding was clutching her daughter so tightly the little girl was squirming. "Mommy, you're hurting me," the child whimpered. The mother's eyes met Sarah's as she passed, and in them, Sarah saw every parent's worst nightmare, the inability to protect their child, the helplessness of knowing that no amount of love could change physics or fix broken engines. "Take care of my baby," the mother mouthed silently, fresh tears cutting tracks down her face. Sarah nodded once, sharp and definite, a promise made and accepted. Jennifer was ahead of her now, half running toward the cockpit, her training taking over even as her composure crumbled. Another flight attendant, the young man Sarah had noticed earlier, stood near the cockpit door, his face pale as chalk. He couldn't have been more than 25, probably new to the job, and he looked like he was about to be sick. "Is she really?" he started. "She's Air Force," Jennifer cut him off, her voice fierce now protective. "She's going to help us. Get back to the cabin and keep everyone as calm as possible." The young attendant nodded and stumbled back down the aisle, grabbing seats for support as the plane continued its sickening descent. Jennifer knocked on the reinforced cockpit door with shaking knuckles, 3 sharp raps that seemed impossibly loud in the emergency-lit corridor. "Captain," she called out, her voice cracking. "Captain Torres, we have a military pilot. Major Sarah Chen, United States Air Force." The seconds waiting for the door to unlock felt eternal. Sarah could hear the strain in the engines, the right one screaming as it tried to compensate for the destroyed left engine, the wounded aircraft fighting against physics and gravity and damaged systems. She could feel the plane struggle through the floor, through the walls, through the air itself. Every instinct she possessed told her they were in serious trouble, that whatever the pilots were dealing with in that cockpit was bad enough to make a veteran captain call for help. Behind the door she heard voices, sharp, urgent, speaking in the clipped technical language of emergency procedures. A warning alarm was blaring continuously, that distinctive sound that meant something critical had failed. She heard Captain Torres' voice, strained with effort. "Override the lock. Get her in here now." The lock clicked. The mechanism disengaged with a mechanical thunk that seemed to seal Sarah's fate. This was the moment, the threshold between being a passenger and being responsible for 147 lives. Her hand reached for the door handle, steady despite everything, despite the fear and the weight and the knowledge that what waited on the other side would test every skill she'd ever learned. Jennifer grabbed her arm one more time, her eyes red and streaming. "Please," she whispered, echoing the elderly woman's plea. "Please save us." Sarah met her gaze and saw her own reflection in Jennifer's eyes, saw the person she'd become through years of service, through combat missions, through choosing again and again to put herself between danger and those who couldn't defend themselves. "That's the plan," she said quietly. Then she pushed open the door and stepped into the cockpit, stepping into a scene that would test everything she'd ever learned, everything she'd ever been, everything she believed about herself and her abilities. The chaos that greeted her was worse than she'd imagined, and in that moment, Major Sarah Chen understood that this would be the flight that defined her entire career. The cockpit looked like a war zone bathed in red emergency lighting. Warning lights blazed across every panel like a Christmas tree designed by nightmares. Master caution, hydraulic pressure, engine fire, flight control, system failure. Alarms screamed for attention in overlapping cascades of electronic panic, each one demanding immediate action, each one announcing a different crisis. The noise was overwhelming, a symphony of disaster that would have paralyzed anyone not trained to function in chaos. But it was the scene in the right seat that made Sarah's heart clench. The first officer, his name tag read M. Webb, slumped against his harness, blood streaming from a deep gash on his forehead where he'd struck the instrument panel during the initial explosion. His eyes were half open, unfocused, mumbling incoherently. "Check the pressure. Need to verify." His words slurred together, signs of a concussion at minimum, possibly worse. And in the left seat, Captain Michael Torres wrestled the yoke with both hands, every muscle in his arm standing out in sharp relief, sweat pouring down his face and soaking through his uniform shirt. He was a man in his late 50s with silver temples and the weathered face of someone who'd spent 30 years in cockpits, but right now he looked like he'd aged a decade in the last 10 minutes. His jaw was clenched so tight Sarah could see the muscle jumping. His eyes locked forward on instruments that were telling him things no pilot ever wanted to see. "Major Chen." Torres didn't look away from the instruments, couldn't afford to. His voice was tight with strain, each word forced out between breaths. "I really hope you're as good as your rank suggests because we are seriously running out of options here." Sarah dropped into the co-pilot's seat, her eyes already performing the rapid instrument scan that was second nature after thousands of flight hours. Oil pressure on the left engine. 0, the engine was dead and likely catastrophically damaged. Hydraulic system A, failed completely. Hydraulic system B, 40% and dropping, red fluid pouring out of the wing like arterial bleeding. Altitude, 32,000 feet and descending at 800 feet per minute. Airspeed, 290 knots, higher than optimal but slowing more risk to stall with asymmetric thrust. Fuel, enough for maybe 25 to 30 minutes if they could level out, which looked increasingly unlikely. The yoke in front of her was shaking with the effort Torres was putting into it, the aircraft fighting him every second, wanting to roll left into a death spiral that would tear them apart before they hit the ground. Sarah's hands hovered over the controls, not touching yet, reading the aircraft's behavior through Torres' struggle. "Talk to me, Captain," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the chaos with the calm authority of someone who'd made life-or-death decisions at supersonic speeds. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Torres barked out a situation report with the efficiency of a man who understood they didn't have time for explanations. "Left engine exploded 14 minutes ago, catastrophic turbine failure, pieces went through the wing and severed hydraulic lines. We've lost system A completely, system B is failing. Flight controls are degraded to maybe 60% effectiveness and dropping. The yoke feels like I'm trying to steer a freight train with dental floss." He shot her a quick glance, his eyes bloodshot and desperate. "I've been flying commercial for 30 years, Major. I've trained for this scenario in every simulator session, but I've never actually done it, not for real, not with this many failures stacking up." Sarah's mind was already running through scenarios, calculating probabilities, assessing options with the cold precision that had kept her alive through 23 combat missions. "What about Denver? You called the diversion." Denver just reported visibility down to a quarter-mile with heavy fog rolling in off the mountains. We'd be landing completely on instruments in a crippled aircraft with degraded controls. Tor's voice cracked slightly. I'm good, Major, but I'm not that good. Not with hydraulics failing and a first officer who can't help because he can't even focus his eyes. Colorado Springs. 30 minutes out, and I don't think we have 30 minutes. The rate we're losing hydraulic pressure, we'll be flying a brick in 15. Torres adjusted his grip on the yoke, fighting another roll. There's one option. Jefferson County Regional Airport, 42 miles east of our current position. Single runway, 6,500 feet, no instrument landing system, minimal emergency services. But it's got one thing going for it, clear skis, and we can make it in under 10 minutes. Sarah pulled up the airport information on the navigation display, her stomach sinking as she read the specs. 6,500 feet. A standard Boeing 737 needed at least 5,000 feet under perfect conditions, full hydraulics, both engines, optimal approach speed, experienced crew. They had one engine failing hydraulics, an injured co-pilot, and would be coming in too fast because slowing down risked a stall. 6,500 feet, she said quietly, running calculations in her head. We'll use every single inch of it. Might? Torres raised an eyebrow, and despite everything, despite the alarms and the dying hydraulics and the 147 people behind them who were counting on them, there was a flash of dark humor in his eyes. Major, I need better odds than might. Sarah turned to face him fully, meeting his gaze with the unflinching directness of someone who'd learned that honesty in crisis was better than false comfort. Captain Torres, I don't deal in certainties. I deal in probabilities and skill. 3 months ago, I brought an F-16 home on one engine with a fire in the cockpit and surface-to-air missiles tracking me. The manual said it was impossible. I did it anyway. She paused, letting that sink in. But I was alone in that cockpit. This time I've got 147 souls depending on us, and I won't lie to you. This is going to be the hardest thing either of us has ever done. Torres stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for something. Confidence, competence, the belief that they could actually pull this off. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him because he nodded once, sharp and definite. Then I guess we'd better be ready to do the impossible. What do you need from me? I need you to keep us in the air and lined up with that runway, Sarah said, her hands finally touching the controls, feeling the aircraft struggle through her fingertips. I'll handle calculations, backup controls, and talk you through the approach. You fly, I think. We work together like we've been doing this for years, not minutes. She reached for the radio. And we need to tell Jefferson County to roll every emergency vehicle they have and pray their fire crews are as good as we're about to need them to be. Torres actually smiled, a tight, grim expression that held no joy but plenty of determination. You know what, Major? When we walked into this cockpit today, neither of us planned on making history, but I think we're about to anyway. Let's make sure it's the right kind of history, Sarah replied, keying the radio. The kind where everyone walks away. She took a breath and began transmitting, her voice steady and professional. Jefferson County Tower, this is United Flight 447, declaring emergency. We are inbound with major systems failures and require immediate emergency response. Prepare for emergency landing. Single runway, full emergency services required. As she spoke, giving them numbers that would make any controller's blood run cold, Sarah felt the familiar calm of a mission settling over her. This was what she'd trained for, not this exact scenario, but this moment when everything was on the line and there was no room for error. Captain Torres was right. They were about to make history. Now they just had to make sure they all survived it. The next 18 minutes were a masterclass in aviation under impossible conditions, a dance between two pilots who'd never met before today, but who moved together with the precision of a surgical team. Sarah's fingers flew over instruments with practiced efficiency, calculating fuel consumption rates against their descent profile, determining optimal approach angles while compensating for the missing engine's thrust, and the asymmetric drag trying to spin them into oblivion. Torres fought the yoke with grim determination, both hands locked in position, making constant micro-adjustments to keep them from rolling left. Sweat dripped from his chin onto his uniform, his breathing coming in controlled bursts that matched his control inputs. Breathe in, correct the roll, breathe out, hold the heading. It was exhausting work, the kind that would leave his arms cramping for days, but he never wavered. Hydraulic pressure is down to 35%, Sarah called out, watching the gauge drop with sickening inevitability. Flaps are responding at 60% efficiency. If we deploy them too early, we might not get them back up if something goes wrong. Too late, and we come in like a missile and blow right through that runway into the prairie. Your call, Major, Torres grunted with effort, wrestling through another oscillation. I'm flying blind here, literally. I've never landed a 737 with failures like this outside of simulation, and the sim never stacked this many problems at once. Tell me what you need and when you need it. Sarah pulled up the airport diagram on her screen, studying the single strip of asphalt that was supposed to save their lives. Runway 1129, running east-west, 6,500 feet of concrete surrounded by open Colorado prairie. No fancy instrument landing system, no precision approach radar, just a simple PAPI light system to tell them if they were too high or too low. Old-school flying, the kind her father had done in the early days of his career. She ran calculations that would have taken most pilots several minutes, her mind processing variables at combat speed. Weight of the aircraft, current fuel load, sink rate, approach speed, wind factors, degraded hydraulic response time, asymmetric thrust compensation. Each variable affected the others in a complex web of physics and probability. Okay, here's what we're looking at, she said, her voice steady despite the numbers that made her stomach clench. We're coming in heavy because we can't dump fuel. The system runs on hydraulics we don't have. That means we need more speed to maintain lift, but more speed means we need more runway to stop. We're looking at a landing speed of about 160 knots when we should be doing 130. That's 40 miles an hour too fast, Torres said flatly, on a runway that's already too short. I know, Sarah's jaw tightened, but if we slow down more, we risk stalling with degraded controls, and then none of this matters because we'll be a crater in the Rockies. Fast landing or no landing, those are our options. They descended through 20,000 feet, the mountains below them jagged and unforgiving in the afternoon light. Sarah contacted Jefferson County Tower, her voice cutting through the static with professional precision. Jefferson County Tower, United 447, we're 22 miles northwest at flight level 200, descending. Be advised we are declaring emergency for engine failure, multiple hydraulic system failures, partial flight control degradation, and injured crew member. We will be landing over gross weight at high speed. Request you clear all traffic and position all emergency equipment. The controller's voice came back, young male, trying desperately to keep his fear out of his transmission and not quite succeeding. United 447, Jefferson County Tower, roger your emergency. All traffic cleared, runway 29er is yours. Emergency equipment is positioning now. Wind 270 at 12 knots. Altimeter 3012. We're showing clear skis, visibility 10 miles. A pause, then quieter. We're praying for you up there. Appreciate the prayers, Sarah replied, but we're going to need physics, skill, and every foot of that runway. Stand by for our approach. She switched to the cabin intercom, knowing that 147 people were hanging on every word, desperate for reassurance she couldn't honestly give. Flight attendants, this is Major Chen in the cockpit. We are 6 minutes from landing at Jefferson County Regional Airport. The approach will be fast and the landing will be hard. I need everyone in full brace position on my mark. Make absolutely certain every passenger understands. Heads down, hands locked, brace against the seat in front of them. Lives will depend on proper position. Through the cockpit door, she heard Jennifer's voice, strong despite the tremor underneath, relaying instructions to the cabin. Sarah imagined the scene back there, the mother curling protectively over her daughter, the elderly couple still holding hands, the teenage boy who'd been recording his goodbye, the businessman from 8B probably white-knuckling his armrests. All of them preparing for impact, all of them trusting that two strangers in the cockpit could defy the odds. At 8,000 feet, they broke through the last wispy clouds, and suddenly the airport appeared below them, a single strip of gray concrete that looked impossibly small from their altitude, like trying to land on a ruler, surrounded by the brown and green patchwork of Colorado prairie. Emergency vehicles were already positioned on both sides of the runway, their lights flashing in silent urgency. Fire trucks, ambulances, rescue equipment, everything Jefferson County had was down there, ready for the worst. Torres saw it too and let out a low whistle. That's a fighter strip, not a commercial runway. I've landed on carriers with less room, Sarah lied again, keeping her voice confident. She'd never landed on a carrier, wrong aircraft, wrong service, but Torres didn't need doubt right now. What he needed was someone who believed they could do this. Line us up, Captain. I'll call out speeds and distances. When I say deploy flaps, you deploy. When I say cut throttle, you cut. Trust me and trust your instincts. Torres nodded, his knuckles white on the yoke. Major, I don't even know your first name, but I'm putting 147 lives in your hands. Sarah, and I'm putting them in yours too. That's how this works. We're a crew now, even if we just met. She glanced at the altimeter, watching their altitude drop through 6,000 feet. Now let's show this wounded bird how combat pilots and commercial captains work together. She keyed the intercom one final time. All passengers, cabin crew, brace for landing, 30 seconds. Below them, the runway grew larger but not fast enough. They were coming in hot, coming in heavy, coming in with one engine and failing systems, and a prayer that skill would be enough. Sarah's hand hovered over the flap control, her eyes locked on the instruments, her mind calculating the exact microsecond when deployment would give them the best chance. Torres' voice was barely a whisper. Here we go. Here we go, Sarah echoed. And together, two pilots who'd never flown together before guided a crippled aircraft toward an impossible landing, threading a needle at 160 knots with 147 lives hanging in the balance. The ground rushed up to meet them. They came in at 165 knots, 40 knots too fast, 10 knots faster than Sarah's calculations had predicted. But slowing more would stall them and turn the aircraft into a tombstone. The runway stretched ahead like a gray ribbon, growing larger but somehow still looking impossibly inadequate. Sarah's eyes flicked between the altimeter, the airspeed indicator, the PAPI lights that would tell them if their glide path was correct, and the rapidly approaching threshold markers. 200 feet, she called out, her voice cutting through the cockpit alarms that still screamed their warnings. 170, 160. We're 5 knots high on approach speed but within parameters. PAPI shows 2 white, 2 red, we're on glide path. Torres' arms trembled with sustained effort, every muscle fiber screaming for relief he couldn't give. The yoke vibrated under his hands as the wounded aircraft fought his commands, the damaged hydraulics responding sluggishly, requiring twice the input for half the result. She's mushy, he grunted. Controls feel like I'm flying through molasses. 150 feet, 140. Sarah's hand moved to the flap control. Hydraulic pressure holding at 28%. If we're going to deploy flaps, it has to be now or never. Your call, Major. Sarah made the decision in a microsecond, weighing variables that had no perfect answer. Flaps now, 25 degrees. Torres' right hand flew to the flap lever while his left maintained pressure on the yoke. The lever moved with agonizing slowness, the dying hydraulic system struggling to comply. Sarah watched the flap indicator, saw the surfaces begin to extend, felt the aircraft's attitude change as additional lift and drag altered their flight characteristics. The plane shuddered violently, dropping nose first for a terrifying second before Torres compensated. Asymmetric deployment, he shouted, Left flaps are slower. I see it. Compensate with aileron, more right rudder. Sarah's hands joined his on the controls now, both of them fighting the aircraft together, combining their strength. Flaps are at 2022. Come on, come on. 100 feet. The ground was rushing up now, details becoming clear. Individual lights on the emergency vehicles, the faces of firefighters looking up, the painted numbers on the threshold marker. 90 feet, 80, flaps locked at 25 degrees. The aircraft settled into a precarious stability, both engines. The good right engine screaming at full power to compensate for the dead left, fighting physics and aerodynamics. They crossed the threshold doing 160 knots with the stall warning chirping intermittently, telling them they were dancing on the edge of disaster. 60 feet, Sarah called. 50, 40 looking good, were drifting left, compensate. Torres threw every ounce of strength into the rudder pedal, forcing the dying hydraulics to respond. Come on, baby, stay with me, he muttered through gritted teeth. Just a little more. 30 feet, 25, cut throttle now. Torres yanked the throttle to idle. The right engine's roar died to a whisper, and suddenly they were falling the last 20 feet, dropping toward concrete at a rate that would test every shock absorber in the landing gear. 15 feet 10, brace, brace. The main wheels struck concrete with a bone-jarring wham that sent shockwaves through the entire airframe. Sarah felt her teeth click together despite her braced position. The aircraft bounced, lifting 6 feet back into the air, and for one heart-stopping moment, she thought they'd porpoised, thought the nose gear would collapse when they came down again. Torres fought the bounce with every skill he possessed, keeping the nose up, letting the main wheels take the second impact. They struck again, harder this time, and stayed down. The nose gear slammed onto concrete with enough force to crack the windscreen, a spiderweb of fractures blooming across Torres' side of the glass. Full reverse thrust, maximum brakes. Sarah's voice was a command, not a suggestion. Torres complied instantly, and the aircraft screamed in metallic agony. The right engine's thrust reverser deployed, creating massive drag, trying to slow 20 tons of metal and fuel and humanity. The brake system, running on the dregs of hydraulic pressure, engaged with a grinding shriek that sounded like the aircraft was tearing itself apart from the inside out. Smoke poured from the landing gear, rubber burning against concrete, the smell of it flooding the cockpit through compromised seals. But they weren't stopping fast enough. The runway end markers were approaching with terrible speed, distance markers counting down like a doomsday clock. 4,000 feet remaining, 3,000, 2,500. We're not stopping, Torres shouted over the noise, his voice cracking with the realization that they'd survived the landing only to die in the overrun. We're not going to make it. Yes, we are. Sarah's hand flew to a red-guarded lever she'd hoped they wouldn't need. Emergency brake system, now. She pulled the lever that Torres had only ever used in simulation, activating the aircraft's backup braking system, a last resort mechanism that would save them or destroy the landing gear trying. The system engaged with a grinding scream that was almost alive, a sound of tortured metal and failing machinery that spoke of a machine being pushed beyond every design limit. The deceleration was brutal, violent, throwing them forward against their harnesses hard enough to bruise. Warning lights flashed across every panel, landing gear stress, brake temperature critical, tire pressure failing. The aircraft shook so violently that rivets popped from the fuselage, pinging against the cockpit walls like bullets. 2,000 feet remaining. 1,500. 1,000. The numbers counted down too slowly, the prairie grass beyond the runway end now clearly visible, individual blades distinct. A field that would be their grave if physics didn't cooperate. 80 knots, 70. The brake temperature gauge went solid red, meaning the brakes were literally melting, metal grinding against metal now that the pads were gone. 60 knots, 50. Emergency vehicles were racing alongside them, keeping pace, ready for the fireball they expected. 40 knots, 35. The runway end loomed, 500 feet, 400, 300. Sarah could see the grass now, could count the individual rocks in the dirt beyond the asphalt. 30 knots, 25. 200 feet remaining, 150. The nose wheel was shaking so violently she thought it would tear free, the entire aircraft vibrating like it was coming apart. 20 knots, 15. 100 feet, 75. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity, each foot of runway precious beyond measure. 10 knots, 5, 50 feet remaining, 25. The aircraft shuddered to a complete, final, absolute stop. Absolute silence fell over the cockpit for one heartbeat. 2. The alarms suddenly seemed distant, unimportant. Through the cracked windscreen, Sarah could see grass, prairie grass swaying in the afternoon breeze, barely 10 feet from the nose wheel. 10 feet. They had stopped with 10 feet of runway remaining. Torres turned to Sarah, his face pale and sweat-soaked, his hands still locked on the yoke even though they were stopped, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His eyes were wide, disbelieving, alive with the manic energy of someone who'd just cheated death. The tower's voice crackled over the radio, professional composure finally breaking completely. Flight 447, you are stopped. Emergency crews are approaching. That was, the controller's voice cracked. That was the most remarkable piece of flying I've ever witnessed. Incredible work. Just incredible. Torres finally found his voice, barely a whisper. 10 feet. We stopped with 10 feet left. He looked at Sarah, and suddenly he was laughing, not humor but the release of unbearable tension, the sound of a man who'd looked death in the face and lived to tell about it. 30 years of flying and I can't even. You just did, Sarah said quietly, already unbuckling her harness, her mind already moving to the next phase. Now let's get these people off safely. We're not done until everyone's breathing and standing on solid ground. Through the cockpit door, she could hear crying, could hear voices raised in disbelief and joy and shock. 147 people who'd prepared to die were alive because of skill and determination, and those precious 10 feet of runway. The mission wasn't over, but the impossible part was done. 20 minutes later, Sarah stood at the base of the emergency slide, her arms extended to catch passengers as they came down. The evacuation had been textbook perfect, flight attendants shouting clear instructions, passengers moving in organized chaos, no one trampled, no panic-induced injuries. The slide hissed and flexed as person after person descended into the waiting arms of first responders and crew members who just pulled off a miracle. The teenage boy who'd been recording his goodbye message slid down, his eyes red from crying but alive, so wonderfully alive. He stumbled at the bottom and Sarah caught him, steadied him. He looked up at her, recognition dawning. You're the pilot. You're the one who saved us. We all saved each other, Sarah said gently, guiding him toward the waiting paramedics. Go get checked out. Call your parents. Tell them you're okay. He nodded, speechless, then impulsively hugged her, a fierce, desperate embrace that spoke of second chances and futures that almost weren't. Sarah hugged him back, feeling the tremor in his shoulders before sending him on his way. The mother with the little daughter came next, the child clutching a stuffed rabbit, oblivious to how close she'd come to never holding it again. The mother's legs gave out at the bottom of the slide and Sarah caught her, held her upright. Thank you, the woman sobbed against Sarah's shoulder. Thank you, thank you, thank you, my baby, my little girl. She's safe, Sarah said firmly, blinking back her own tears. You're both safe, that's all that matters. One by one they came. The elderly couple, still holding hands, moving slowly but steadily. The businessman from 8B, who grabbed Sarah's hand and shook it so hard it hurt, words tumbling out in an incoherent rush of gratitude. Jennifer, the flight attendant, professional composure completely shattered, openly weeping as she helped passengers evacuate. Sarah helped the injured first officer, Marcus Webb, down the stairs. The slide was too dangerous for someone with a head injury. Two paramedics immediately took over, loading him onto a stretcher, checking his vitals, asking questions he answered with increasing coherence. He'd be okay. They'd all be okay. As the last passenger touched ground, Sarah turned to head back toward the aircraft to help Tors secure the cockpit. That's when she heard the news vans, 3 of them pulling up to the airport perimeter, satellite dishes extending like metallic flowers blooming toward the sky. A reporter was already out of the van, microphone in hand, cameraman right behind her. "Captain Tors," the reporter shouted, her voice carrying across the tarmac. "Can we get a statement? Who landed the plane? What happened up there? We're hearing reports of a military pilot." Sarah quietly walked in the opposite direction, toward the back of the emergency vehicles where shadows and confusion provided cover. She'd learned long ago that real heroism didn't need cameras, that service meant doing what needed to be done and then stepping back into the background. A young paramedic noticed her military ID still clipped to her jacket. "Ma'am, are you the pilot everyone's talking about? The one who?" "Just a passenger who helped out," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "There's a captain over there, Captain Tors, who deserves all the attention. I need to make a phone call." She borrowed the paramedic's phone and called her commanding officer, Colonel Richards. "Sir, it's Major Chen. I need a pickup from Jefferson County Regional Airport in Colorado. And sir, there's going to be media attention. I'd appreciate getting out before that becomes a problem." Richards didn't ask questions. He'd worked with Sarah long enough to know she wouldn't request extraction without good reason. Within 90 minutes, a military transport touched down on that same runway, and Sarah slipped aboard while reporters were still interviewing Tors and survivors, while cameras captured tearful reunions and miracle stories. She was back at her base that evening, still wearing her civilian clothes, still carrying the weight of 147 lives saved, but wanting nothing more than a shower and her own bed. 3 days passed. Sarah was in her office reviewing flight training protocols when Colonel Richards knocked and entered without waiting, his face unreadable. "Chen, close the door." Orchestrated character arc emphasizing humility over accolades. The colonel is about to tell her about all the recognition, the calls from Tors, the airline, the FAA. She'll decline the public recognition. Need to show her humility and her true motivation, service over glory. Sarah's stomach tightened had she overstepped by intervening on a civilian flight. Richards dropped a folder on her desk with a heavy thud. The FAA called, so did United Airlines. So did someone named Captain Michael Tors, who apparently won't stop calling until he talks to you. He paused, studying her face. Tors submitted a formal commendation. So did the FAA investigator. So did the Airline Safety Board. They're calling it the most remarkable emergency landing in commercial aviation in 20 years. Sarah looked down at the folder, unopened. She could imagine what was inside. Official documents, commendations, probably photos someone had taken of the aircraft stopped mere feet from disaster. Tors told the media, and yes, Major, it made national news, that a military officer saved 147 lives and then disappeared before anyone could even thank her properly. Richard's voice softened slightly. "The airline wants to give you a Civilian Medal of Valor. The FAA wants you to speak at their annual safety conference. Tors keeps saying he owes you his life and wants to meet your family. Half of those passengers have been calling military public affairs trying to find you." Sarah thought about the teenager preparing to say goodbye to his parents, the elderly couple holding hands in the face of death, the mother protecting her daughter, the businessman who'd grabbed her arm, Captain Tors wrestling a dying aircraft with everything he had. "Sir, can you thank them on my behalf? Tell them I appreciate the recognition, but I'm needed here, training the next generation of combat pilots. That's where I can do the most good." Richard studied her for a long moment, and something like respect flickered in his eyes. "You know, Chen, Most officers would jump at this kind of recognition. Career-making stuff. Medals, interviews, maybe a promotion. Most officers didn't sign up to serve quietly, sir. I did. She finally opened the folder, scanned the commendations, saw the photos of the aircraft, the destroyed engine, the stopped plane with prairie grass feet from the nose, the crack pattern across the windscreen that looked like a spiderweb. But could you do me one favor? Make sure Captain Torres knows I think he's one of the finest pilots I've ever flown with. Every passenger on that plane survived because of his skill under impossible pressure. He deserves all the recognition, not me. I'll tell him, Richard said quietly. But between you and me, Major, the world needs more heroes like you, the kind who show up when called, do what needs to be done, and then walk away without needing applause. He moved toward the door, then paused. Torres asked me to give you something, said you'd understand. He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a simple business card, Captain Michael Torres with his contact information, and a handwritten note on the back. Sarah, you gave 147 people their lives back, including mine. If you ever need anything ever, you call me. Thank you for being ready when the moment called. Mike. Sarah tucked the card into her pocket, blinking against the sudden burning in her eyes. 2 weeks later, she was back in the cockpit of her F-16, running training exercises with young pilots fresh out of flight school, teaching them emergency procedures and crisis management, and how to think clearly when everything was going wrong. They had no idea their instructor had just saved a commercial aircraft. She preferred it that way. But sometimes, late at night, she'd think about Seat 8A, about the moment she stood up when no one else could. About 147 people going home to their families because someone was ready when the moment called. And she'd smile. Captain Torres kept her business card in his wallet and told the story at every safety conference he attended, always ending the same way. She didn't do it for medals or recognition. She did it because it was right, because she could, because that's what real heroes do. The passengers formed a group that still meets every year on the anniversary, calling themselves the 447 Survivors. They raise money for aviation safety, support first responders, and each year they try to find Major Sarah Chen to thank her. Each year, she politely declines their invitations. And somewhere over the Atlantic, on another red-eye flight, Major Sarah Chen sits in Seat 8A when she can get it, her baseball cap pulled low over her eyes, sleeping the sleep of someone who's earned their rest, ready to do it all over again if the moment ever calls. Because that's what heroes do. They show up, they serve, they save lives, and then they return to the shadows, knowing that the real reward isn't recognition. It's the knowledge that 147 people went home to their families, that a teenage boy got to apologize to his parents in person, that a little girl still has her mother, that an elderly couple got more time together. Sarah Chen never sought glory. She sought only to serve. And in that quiet dedication to duty over fame, she became exactly the kind of hero the world needs most, the kind who's always ready, always capable, always there when it matters. And always, ready to return to Seat 8A and sleep quietly, waiting for the next moment when someone, somewhere, might need a combat pilot who knows how to save the day without needing the world to know her name. The end.